Cafe Cabaret, of course, is produced by Francis DiMenno, who bears a striking resemblance to the wrong hero. I'm the wrong hero. No, actually, I'm a rather hungry German Shepherd, and I haven't been fed yet, and somebody ought to go feed me right now. That's better. The dog is being fed, and now it's time for us to commence with our award-winning, that is, of course, a self-designated award, presentation of the wrong hero's history of comedy and humor in the American tradition. Well, when we left you last week, you were probably in a stupor or slumber. So, let us not deviate from our lesson plan, but go directly into the chapter entitled Invective, subtitled Invective, Insult, and Practical Jokes. There will also be additional notes on the audience, the heckler, and oratory, which comes at a most auspicious time. I suppose if we are considering the presidential race, which is beginning to heat up in a big way. Delicious phosphoric acid, the wrong hero's favorite beverage treat. Well, it has been said by none other than Carol Phillips that to adopt a heartless position, one that has little concern for people beyond ridiculing their sad manifestations of self-delusory grandeur, one that seemingly relishes the exposition of man's essential fragility, one that ceaselessly mocks man's capacity to dare and dream, is to pour scorn on oneself as son, brother, father, husband. Such a position undermines the elemental bonds that unite us one to the other, and ultimately, if one is a writer, damages one's capacity to write fiction or non-fiction. Well, but what she doesn't say is that it sure is a heck of a lot of fun slinging that invective around. Yeehaw! Now, in Cohen's legendary book, Humor of the Old Southwest, he states that some elements of Southwestern humor were more amusing when the sketches were written than now. It is something of a shock to see pranksters playing practical jokes at funerals, making fun of the disappointed, the sick, the deformed, or glorifying in the bodily discomfort of their fellows. It is amazing how much of this unhealthy humor there is in Southwestern tales, and for that matter, in Arnold Schwarzenegger films. Professor Cohen, a learned man he, goes on to state, the prankster has attempted to bring laughter into a realm of the reader's experience where it is ordinarily forbidden. Now, Alberon Waugh had something very interesting to say about the difference between American and British humor. He stated that the British regard humor as basically being everywhere, and they don't draw these invidious distinctions between times at which it is appropriate and times at which it is inappropriate to react with humor. Unfortunately, I will not be able to find this quotation. However, perhaps later in our presentation, that is to say, sometime in the next few weeks, it will in fact come up. That noise you hear is the dog, who's incredibly excited because instead of the usual all-meat dinner, it had rice and vegetables as well. And it is sort of pulling its gums along the floor for some mysterious reason. And that is basically what the practical joke is. It is attempting to bring laughter into a realm of the reader's experience where it is ordinarily forbidden, or for that matter, into a realm of another individual's experience. In his comic treatment of death and bodily decay, Professor Gerwin goes on to state, the Southwestern writer was not without precedent, i.e., macabre jokes are common in Elizabethan literature. So that's something to keep in mind if you happen to be taking a seminar on Shakespeare. For what is the entire Alas Poor Yorick monologue in the fourth act of Hamlet, scene 1, but that very same sort of macabre humor which the Elizabethans so delighted in. Now, when we speak of Southwestern humor, we're referring roughly to the period 1820 to 1850. I suppose the Puritans and revolutionaries were a rather dour lot by comparison, and contented themselves with getting drunk, reading prayer books, and bundling on those cold New England nights. Barbara Meale states, as the mainstream becomes ever more self-censoring, rather crude and unedifying people step into the spotlight. That should be enjoyed by the more thoughtful by offering essential truths, however brashly. Now, that's an important point. If there is, in fact, a censorious point of view, which is prevalent in mass media, then the crude and unedifying people go into the entertainment business to shatter the taboos which had heretofore been unshatterable. Paul Johnson talks of H.L. Mencken and says, their archetypal journalist, H.L. Mencken, set new world standards in vituperation and persiflage. Now, educated Americans, especially the ruling class of businessmen, politicians, academics, and media people, are terrified of opening their mouths on any topic even vaguely connected to race. And for that matter, we might talk a little bit about class as well. And not only class, but what has been posited as the three basic tribes of employed individuals, the Mandarin class, the lifers, and the talents, which is some have said is even a greater taboo than that of class distinctions based on wealth or breeding. Well, Charles Peters states, the country is rapidly becoming Limbaugh-ized, a condition where snide sarcasm and inflexible ideology are more important than a thoughtful search for agreement about how to fix what's wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, the Washington Monthly is one of my favorite journals, and I often find everything that Charles Peters says to be utterly fascinating, and yet, who wants to go through life simply reading boring uplift when there's a whole world of vituperation out there which really has been quite neglected over the past 50 years, ever since, in fact, the passing of H.L. Mencken, and I would commend you to his two Chrestomathies, the second one having just recently come out, edited by Terry Teachout, I believe. And I've been reading in the second one, having thoroughly exhausted the first, and I find a great deal of merit in particularly his essay on the Rotarians, which is somewhere near the beginning of the book in the section entitled Americana. When skepticism engulfs everything, says William Salatin, there is no truth. Well, that may well be. One does need a certain amount of falsehood to set the truth in a greater perspective. Edgar Allan Poe, states Phoebe Pettingill, as for his critical judgments, vitriol rarely retains its strength over the course of a century. And that is one of the wonderful things about being in the profession of critic, is that you can wheel out whole long phrases connected one to the other of vitriolic writing. And not only are you not criticized for doing so, but it is in fact your job. You would not believe what the dog is doing. It's rubbing its ear with its leg. I think maybe it wants to go out. No! Don't do that. Don't even come anywhere near that thing. He's getting my girlfriend's best suit and getting a little too close to it. Okay, Mona? Okay, go back to what you're doing. The recklessness of Martin Amis's writing, British writer, underlies the fact that the novel's just a burst of undifferentiated animosity, that it has no real emotional center. See, now that can be very helpful, a lesson to consider, that in fact you cannot write a book which is pure vituperation at the 300-page length that such novels would normally be published at. You would have to set it off with a certain amount of character study. More on that in the section entitled The Novel, which will be coming up in about 3 more weeks. Name-calling is not argumentation, says David W. Gerbing? No. In fact, it's a rhetorical device called the ad hominem attack. And of course, though it can be a useful device of the type of rhetoric practiced in, say, political campaigns, it is not considered to be anything that will score you debate points in a formal debate, which, don't fool yourself, very few of the presidential debates have adhered whatsoever to the rules of formal debate. And I should know because I spent 5 years on a debating team. Andrew Ferguson talks a little more about H.L. Mencken, who's very important in this regard. A woman named Judith Rosner wrote a book called The Hater's Handbook, and then there's the portable curmudgeon volumes of John Winokur, if you want more examples of vituperative persiflage. But H.L. Mencken still wins hands down. Our patron saint is the great Mencken. In the first of his books to sell widely, Prejudice's first series, he set the standard that all may aspire to and none may attain. The object of his attacks made up a catalog of respectable figures, from Bernard Shaw to Thorsten Veblen, William Allen White to Joyce Kilmer. All were revered as a matter of etiquette by the genteel press of their time, and, for example, Walter Cronkite is today. And most, like Cronkite, were utterly vacant men. Mencken's most outrageous hits did not spring, as some of his apologists say, from a fierce sense of outraged propriety. He wasn't moralizing, he was having fun. When he composed his famous tribute to William Jennings Bryan, a charlatan, a mountebank, a zany without censored dignity, he was delighting in the rapture that seizes a man when he is saying something that no one dares say, and which, on reflection, is almost certainly true. Now, that's an important lesson for a stand-up comedian to keep in mind, that one of the rewards of the profession, quite aside from the laughter and adulation of the teeming masses, is the notion that eventually may become ingrained, like that of Dennis Miller, for example, if one is not careful. The rapture that seizes a man when he is saying something that no one else dares say, and which on reflection is almost certainly true. Those are the hits that one longs for in the stand-up profession. Quite aside from the relatively unambitious comedian who is serving as a mere tranquilizer to further stupefy an already thoroughly stupefied audience with brand names and the names of celebrities, and isn't it a funny thing that happens when you ride on an airplane, etc., etc., etc. Instead of that kind of comedian, what I look up to, is the type of comedian, and I'll repeat it one more time, who delights in the rapture that seizes a man when he is saying something that no one else dares say. Helen Osborne states that revenge is one of the few sweeteners in the life of a working writer, if he has a drop of patience in his soul. Lurking in the nib of his pen is a venom more deadly and enjoyable than any of the muck, malice, and denigration chucked at him by critics and soi-disant colleagues. And that's a very important thing to remember. It was George Orwell in one of his essays on being a writer who stated that the primary motivation of the writer is revenge. And I will make a little note here. C.F. Orwell. Because if I ever do get to teach this class in an academic setting, that will remind me to once again refer to George Orwell. And now we're quoting Andrew Ferguson further on H.L. Mencken. Once again, Mencken serves as guide. For a hit to be successful, the bile should be genuine and unforced. Its corrosive effect should expose not merely the subject's vanity, but also some larger sham. Motive mongering is forbidden, as are details of the subject's personal life. Aim should, of course, be taken at public figures only. The more honored, the better. Mort Zuckerman is suitable. The poor saps who collect rent checks for him are not. And journalists themselves should not be excluded from that category of deserving targets, especially if they are more prominent and better paid than I. As for the wounded feelings, we should bear in mind the impenetrable vanity that girds most public figures. So, once again, you may just be a little voice off in the distance, but that is not any means a reason why you should not take as your mission calling public figures to account. Hunter S. Thompson states that there are lots of ways to practice the art of journalism, and one of them is to use your art like a hammer to destroy the right people, who are almost always your enemies, and who usually deserve to be crippled because they are wrong. This is a dangerous notion, and few professional journalists will endorse it. And of course, if Hunter S. Thompson is, in fact, a professional journalist, then he is, in fact, one of the few. But again, this notion that vituperation, rhetoric, and invective have some sort of a cleansing notion is almost pathological among its practitioners. Very few of them admit to the sheer joy of giving some high muckety-muck the what for. A nasty quote is beautiful. It's like haiku poetry, a put down in 2 sentences, says Ross Petrus. And there are at least a few types of nasty quotes cited by Ross and Kathleen Petrus in the 776 Nastiest Things Ever Said. And they categorize these as the witty put down, the deadly description, and snappy comeback. And the witty put down would be something like Norman Mailer is a master of the single entendre, but it's also, of course, a deadly description, such as Truman Capote's famous statement about Jack Kerouac's On the Road. That's not writing, that's typing. And of course, the snappy comeback. Age before beauty, said Claire Booth Luce. Pearls before swine, says Dorothy Thompson, sweeping in before her. An apocryphal tale, by the way. The 4 main classes of things that people find disgusting. Now, of course, these are also cited in The Rationale of the Dirty Joke in a lengthy chapter entitled Disease and Disgust. And they are food violations. Gershon Langman refers to these as food dirtying. Sexual violations, body fluids and products, and physical violations of the body exterior. So be careful when you talk too long and loud about brownies resembling feces. Some people won't find that at all edifying or amusing, at least among the more sophisticated types. Every joke, says George Orwell, a man whose essays I cannot recommend highly enough. I believe he is one of the 2 great essayists of this century, the other being H.L. Mencken. There are other great essayists, but those 2 seem to occupy some sort of hallowed ground, and I would be extremely loath to pick between them. But since one of them is an American and one of them is British, then I don't have to really pick between them. I can simply say that Mencken is by far my favorite 20th century American essayist. Not that I could rattle off more than a few other names of essayists, James Thurber, E.B. White, there are many more, but you get my point. And of course, George Orwell, Eric Blair, is one of the finest essayists of the United Kingdom in the 20th century. Very few people have equaled him either in output or in the sheer common senseness of his writings. Every joke is a tiny revolution. Something to keep in mind. What is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist. Something for practitioners of political correctness to keep in mind. Ironically enough, this was a quote by Salman Rushdie. Now, P. Conison Boyle. Geez. Is it possible that I have mislaid this quotation? It is entirely possible. But T. Conison Boyle said something somewhat similar when he stated that political correctness can serve as a stifling influence. Here's the exact quote. PC censors would have us write only about ourselves within very narrow boundaries, and if that doesn't foment factionalism, mistrust, and misunderstanding, I don't know what does. So this notion that only black people can tell jokes about black people, only Italians such as myself can tell Italian jokes, only Poles such as myself can tell Polish jokes. Mr. Boyle seems to find this point of view fallacious, and I'm afraid I have to agree with him. Marjorie Garber talks about people who make a career out of being offensive. Today's salon des refusés is often tomorrow's benchmark, and today's young Turk is all too often tomorrow's old-timer or curmudgeon or traditionalist. After all, a curmudgeon is just a cynic who has passed the age of 55 or thereabouts. Count up what was bitter and kept you awake, advises Ceylon to the writer of Invective. And I rather wish that I had a great deal more to say on the topic of invective, but I'm afraid that what I have said so far will simply have to suffice until such time as I come up with a follow-up to this series about American comedy, with some notes on British comedy as well. Now we're talking a little bit about something which is directly related to the topic of invective, sizing up an audience with special attention paid to the phenomenon of the heckler. Now, I will leave my notes aside momentarily and direct you, and Mona, there's a heckler right here. That's right, look my face. Look my face. You've been eating your own cock on it. Look my face. That's right, doggy germs, doggy germs. How you doing, Mona? How do you like this, huh? Yeah? Huh? Okay, you served your purpose, canine beast. Now, go. Go, I say. I'll take you out later. You'll get your piss, don't worry. Anyway, the heckler, it's a pretty darn low-down thing for someone to heckle a stand-up comedian. Now, that does not mean that you should sit like some sort of sphinx or mummy and not respond in any way to something that a comedian says. Sometimes some comedians like to work the room, and they take a great deal of pleasure in coming up with spontaneous ripostes to things that people in the crowd shout out. However, there are two occasions in which you should never, ever, ever, ever say anything to somebody who is performing on stage. One is when it's going very, very badly for them, and the other, I forget. So heckle me. When it's going badly for a stand-up comedian and he's not getting any laughs, one of the last things you want to do is heckle in the misbegotten hope that somehow you will help his monologue by chiming in with your own 2 cents. If anything, you will probably make him further lose his grip and guarantee that a thoroughly tedious time will be had for the remainder of his set. The other time that you shouldn't say anything is when you're incredibly drunk, because, of course, nothing you say is going to really make very much sense, and the comedian will home in on the fact that you are 2 sheets to the wind and will probably humiliate you. But the whole thing about comedy is maintaining control of the stage. That stage is a comedian's turf, and if you heckle him, then you are transgressing his boundaries. And although he makes his living transgressing societal boundaries to a certain degree, that does not necessarily mean that you should attempt to give him a taste of his own medicine. Believe me, it's difficult enough without having somebody decide that they're in direct competition with the person on stage, and yet they haven't bothered to write their own monologues, so they figure they're just going to hook on, lamprey like to the hard work that someone else has put in, which has brought them to the stage that they're at, mainly the stage. When you're going good, you don't hear the hecklers, you don't hear the noise. It's really a matter of concentration, says Patrice O'Neill, directly contradicting everything I've just said. Well, sometimes you can, in fact, bulldoze your way right over hecklers. Dana Gold says, I like to just go on stage and be as honest as possible about whatever emotional or cultural life I'm living at the moment. The best bits are the ones that are both funny and disconcerting. It's good when the audience worries where you're going next. Honesty is the most dangerous thing you can do in comedy. Now, besides I don't think he's talking about the sort of canned monologue that old style comedians used to come up with, a la, a funny thing happened to me on the way over here. Unless, in fact, a funny thing did, in fact, happen to you that very week that you're doing the monologue. It's kind of cheating, particularly if there's a discerning member of the audience who has seen your monologue more than once in the last 6 months, and you use the exact same line both times. It says something to the need of having to constantly come up with new material, because, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also that new material gives you ammunition against the type of heckler who would call you to task for having said the same thing the last several times he saw you. There is no convincing evidence that writers can do their job by being nice, says John Ralston Saul. And that, of course, goes for comedians as well. But I'm not saying that one need be a fountain of vituperation in order to succeed in the stand-up comedy business. Far from it. In fact, the temperament of the stand-up comedian is in large part the main factor in whether or not he will be successful, because the temperament will not only enable him to get along with people who can advance his career, but the temperament will, more importantly, enable him to get along with the audience. It's very important that you get along with the audience. They can tolerate stupidity, but not a supercilious sense of your superiority to them that will emanate from your very core. The audience is not one big, seamless, dumb mass. The audience is composed in the main of discerning individuals who can, in fact, read you to a certain degree. Other comedians will watch a comedian with a sort of neutrality, listening very hard for how good the material is and whether they can rip it off. But the audience is more attuned to more intangible factors, body language, the way one presents oneself, the amount of confidence that one hears in the comedian's voice or lack thereof. Jiranovsky, says John Cohan, has a talent for timing the rhythms of his harangues to the emotional heartbeats of those around him. And if in fact you are going to indulge in harangues, that is a useful attribute to cultivate, the talent for timing the rhythms of your harangues to the emotional heartbeats of those around you. Well, let's see now. It's Tuesday night. What could you be watching right now instead of this? It's about 9:30. Let's see, what's usually on 9:30? Drew Carey? Nice guy, nice guy. I mean, you know, the way he presents himself, that short crew cut, kind of overweight, kind of conventional, barbecue, backyard barbecue type suburb, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best type comedy. But, you know, there's a place for that. There's a place for that. Let's see, college basketball on ESPN. Who knows if that's still on? Not an awful lot on at 9:30, so you might as well stick with me. You probably have another television somewhere. Tape Drew Carey on the other TV if it has a VCR and watch this, or better yet, tape this so you'll have a permanent copy and you can go through it step by step. And you can just watch Drew Carey now if you like. You know what gets me though is that horrible song that Frasier sings at the beginning of his show or at the end or whatever. Tossed salad and scrambled eggs. I say it again. Why is it that every damn comedian in the world can't be content just with being a comedian? They have to prove their gift of sparkling repartee by becoming a talk show host or aspiring to motion picture stardom or, God help us, coming out with a comedy album with interspersed musical numbers which are not in fact humorous, like Robert Klein did with his album Mind Over Matter, which was very, very disappointing to me. I mean, you buy a 45-minute LP of comedy, you expect 45 minutes of comedy. I mean, there's some people that can come out with 5 record sets of just one monologue. Lenny Bruce is a notable example. Lenny Bruce stated that the job of the stand-up comedian is to get one laugh every 25 seconds for a period of 45 minutes, 90% of the time. And that way, you can consider yourself a stand-up comedian. Well, I have done several 45-minute sets, and perhaps I've been able to do that for about 20 minutes of those 45 minutes in all. So I guess I'm about halfway there. Of course, then again, I've done 45-minute sets where there has not been really one good, solid laugh in the entire thing. And I've done 12-minute sets where the laughs are only about 3 minutes in duration, which means that I should do some more cutting and do a 3-minute set. That's what people want to know. Why can't you just do, 5 minutes of your best stuff instead of 12 minutes of your half good stuff? The stand-up comedian, every time he gets up there, unless he's like just a total zombie, he's trying out new material, and he needs to get audience reaction in order to know whether or not the material is going to work or not, or indeed whether or not it can be made to work. There have been people throughout history who have managed to inflict their worst preoccupations on an alien environment. Barbara Emile speaking of Queen Victoria. And that, in fact, is what the heckler does. They inflict their own worst preoccupations on an alien environment. It's, of course, the stand-up comedy club is basically, for the most part, it's just a brick wall with some name like Giggles or Stitches or Hardy Har Har or whatever they want to call it. And I've done more than a few of these places, so I know. And there is a certain element of the firing squad about working in a stand-up comedy environment, and yet, at the same time, remember that the purpose of going there is to laugh. Shakespeare stated, "A jest's prosperity lies in the ear of him that hears it, never in the tongue of him that makes it." Well, sure, it's how I tell it is a standard little pat on the back that comedians give themselves, but they really wouldn't be anywhere if they didn't have an audience who is capable of comprehending their wry quips, japes, and merry jests. Richard Pryor said to Flip Wilson, or maybe it was the other way around, "You're the only performer that I've ever seen who goes on the stage and the audience hopes that you like them." A very enviable position to be put in. I think Barry Crimmins is another person that I sort of feel that way about. Cuomo, on how he did all those long speeches back when he was still in the business of giving a speech at virtually every single college, university, what have you, teachers college, community college, secondary school. The guy was all over the map for a time in the 1990s, in 1992. He spoke at New England Technical College not more than 3 weeks after he spoke at Harvard to dedicate a building at the Kennedy School of Government Library, which was on C-SPAN incidentally, but I was present there physically as well. The man is a master orator, but I did notice that there were great similarities between his 2 separate and distinct speeches given not more than several weeks apart, except he sucked up to the Harvard crowd by saying something to the effect that, "Well, you don't want to hear about economics. You're Harvard people, and even you're bored." Well, he didn't trot that line of reasoning out at the New England Technical College where he gave a speech later that spring. But, anyway, Cuomo only used notes, single word clues, and my advice to stand-up comedians, if they must use notes, and sometimes you just have a whole lot of new material and you just don't have the time to memorize it all, especially if you have to actually work for a living, sometimes you can use a cheat sheet. Sure, it's okay, especially if you're not getting paid for the damn gig, and if there aren't any industry honchos lurking in the wings, then who's to know or care? It's more important to do the new material, I think, than it is to actually memorize it. Once you've determined whether or not the material will get laughs, that's the time to incorporate it into your set. And the way to do that is to put them in some sort of logical order and prepare a cheat sheet that has single word clues that will enable you to figure out what the joke was about. I'm not saying don't rehearse by any means. The more you rehearse, the better, the smoother the presentation is. The less time it will take and the more laughs you will get. I guarantee it. Because if you're going hemming and hawing, going and and then that eats up an awful lot of time, and you're also tempted to, if you're not doing well, things are going badly because you haven't rehearsed, you're tempted to speak too quickly. So, if you're ever tempted to become a stand-up comedian or to tell jokes, slow things down by a factor of about 2 whenever you hit the big time for the first time. That was advice that was given to some Boston comic his first time on The Tonight Show, back when that was the vehicle for breaking young talent. It's funny when they say young comedians, it could be anybody from 23-year-old David Spade to 60 or 70-year-old Mort Sahl, but generally the young comedian can be 40 and nobody thinks this is anomalous. Just like a politician at 40 is considered young, but a baseball player at 40 is considered over the hill. Comedy is not something that is better when you're younger, necessarily. Comedy can improve with age. One's comic viewpoint can become deeper and more mature. Unfortunately, if your audience is primarily composed of 25-year-olds and you're some 40-year-old geezer up there talking about the Brady Bunch, well, actually that would work, but talking about Ed Sullivan and the moonwalk, then you might start to lose your audience there. And you've got to think young, even if you have the benefit of wisdom and experience that younger people do not have. When you're on a roll, says Mario Cuomo, when you're on a roll that goes so deep inside you that you can feel that it has to come up for air or die, you suddenly hear the people in the audience give you your own lines. In the embracing stares, the tilts of the heads, the passive passion of the faces. It is as if you have shared an inchoate mass of thought and have decided to produce the mutually agreed upon sentence. When that sentence is produced, when it is stretched in the air like an arrow, it hits home even as it flies. Well, he must have been on quite a roll when he came up with that. Joan Rivers talks about resort audiences, and it's very amusing that she goes on at such length about them. But of course, Joan Rivers is a very talented woman, even if she really hasn't been in the news for the past 5 or 6 years, an awful lot. At one time, why, she was her generation's Phyllis Diller. I think she was much better than Phyllis Diller, even though sometimes her grating voice gave me the hives. Resort audiences were the worst in the world. They thought the peak of sophistication was saying, I've seen them all and I've walked out on them all. Still, she was grateful for their hostility. It made her redouble her efforts to succeed. If I had been a hit in the Catskills that summer, I probably would not be where I am today. Now, I think, in my own personal experience, one of the hardest cities to work is Boston. And so, if there's any young, aspiring comedians out there, take heart. If you can kill them in Boston, you've got your ticket to ride anywhere in the country. Even if you go venture 52 miles south to Providence, you've pretty much, if you've proven yourself up in Boston, my God. Well, last few weeks ago, I did a show at Cafe Liberty in Cambridge, and I was getting an awful lot of good laughs, and I was wondering why, and then I realized The guy who was laughing was from Chicago. He'd never seen anything like this before. And he assured me that I was good, which is always good to hear, even if you think that it's kind of simultaneously condescending and redundant for people in the audience to remind you of this. Nevertheless, it is awfully nice to hear. Like his male colleagues, Mal Z. Lawrence long ago sized up his audience and decided to specialize in the problems of failing financial, sexual, and digestive powers. Now, this is something that is a very valuable lesson for a comedian to specialize, to pick one topic about which nobody knows nearly as much as you, or very few people know as much as you, or few comedians can master your command and grasp of this topic. Now, I'm not suggesting you work it to death, but if you can come up with that one golden phrase, like Rodney Dangerfield's "I don't get no respect," then your output will probably increase fivefold. Now, I'm not sure I've come up with that phrase. I've toyed with several such phrases, like "Silence, earth filth, the master speaks," and "You are beginning to make me nervous because you're evil." Evil, evil. But I don't do that as much anymore. I'm really more into coming up with new material than I am in trading on the glories and good times of the past. One cannot coast in this profession. One has to constantly keep doing what one does. It's a lifetime task. It's not something that you learn in a year or two. It can take 10 or 20 years. Sorry to discourage you. Same is true of any writing or any artistic endeavor for that matter. Painting, sculpture, music, you name it, it takes several years to master it. To gain that sort of unfeigned ease, that seemingly unrehearsed but highly rehearsed patina of spontaneity, takes many years. Louis MacNeice's jobs, a university lecturer, a BBC producer, depended on successfully assessing the needs of a particular audience. Again, that is your job. Not only is it your job to come up with the subject that's going to be your ruling subject in your monologues. Mine, of course, if you must know, is the degradation of myth, the distance between what people believe and what is in fact the case, which, for that matter, is the starting point of virtually all satire. Not only do you have to come up with your special particular topic, but you also have to be able to assess the needs of a particular audience if you wish to be highly successful. Now we're going to talk a little bit about neuro-linguistic programming, cited by Milton Erickson. Are you going to be surprised when you're completely changed tomorrow afternoon? Said Milton Erickson to one rather foul-mouthed individual who was seeking his help in being not deprogrammed, not programmed, but reprogrammed with neuro-linguistic programming, the power of words to turn an on-off switch in a person's mind and make them see, be it the light or the idea that they hadn't hitherto grasped. I know from my own personal experience. I had someone come up to me at a party, it was probably about a good 20 years ago almost, and they said to me, "Just tell yourself, you can make it without pot." Well, it took quite a while for that lesson to sink in, but eventually it did. One does not have to depend upon artificial stimulants in order to do what one does to its perfect degree. Because initially what may, in fact, help you in time merely enables you and eventually will prevent you from accomplishing what your expertise has enabled you to accomplish so far. Someone once said to me that it blunts your wit, and the same is true of any drug, really. It blunts your wit. Successful service depends on whether the salesperson's definition of friendliness matches the customer's opinion. Now, there is a standard of comedic friendliness which, although it's not expected or compulsory, can, if spontaneous and natural, ease the way for the stand-up comedian. And it's sort of more or less the generic, hi, how are you? Good to be here. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. Maybe a comment or two on the show in general. And then right into the jokes. Friendliness is not just a big old club that we hit people with. It can be a surgically precise instrument. And again, I guess I'll relate a boring story from my own life in times. During the big blizzard of '96, I had parked my truck on a side street, the name of which I am not at liberty to divulge because then all you moochers will be there parking your stuff there. It's about the only street in Cambridge you can park and not get a ticket for storage. But I did get 2 tickets because my truck was stuck in a snowdrift for 5 days. And if it weren't for the help of 2 individuals, rather young and hirsute, in a Volkswagen who came to my aid and helped push me out of that embankment, I might be there yet. But in any event, I got 2 traffic tickets for 2 parking tickets for having left it there for 5 days. And I went up to Inman Street in Cambridge to dispute the tickets, as you are entitled to do. Unfortunately, the man in front of me was giving the officer who's in charge of these appeals a very, very hard time, and things were escalating to the point where he was taking her name, she was taking his name, he was filing to complain about her, she was going to complain about him, and it was not a very auspicious sign. And then she went to her little warren to stew for a minute or so. When she came back, the first thing I said to her was, well, I think you're doing a good job, even though you don't always excuse my tickets. And then I explained my plight and told her that I could understand the one ticket but not the other. And she forgave me a $15 ticket, even though by rights she didn't necessarily have to, because the person who followed me used a different tactic. She said, I couldn't get my car out. Why are you giving me a ticket? It's the city's duty to plow. But, of course, that didn't work. Friendliness is what works. And I genuinely did feel sorry for her. I felt a certain kinship to this woman who was the traffic officer because I was in many similar situations in my own customer service career. Colin Powell, whatever happened to him, huh? Perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. And this sort of sunny with it type of attitude, I'm wide awake and engaged in the world. You can't really determine to be friendly, but you can at least try to determine to not let setbacks totally befoul your mood. It's of vital importance to the stand-up comedian who will sometimes find they've gone 5 minutes without a laugh. Well, the worst thing to do would be to simply drone on and on, getting more and more angry and upset and snapping at the crowd and lashing out at them. Best thing to do in that circumstance would probably be to leave, but if not, to flick a conceptual switch and say, so far this hasn't been so good, but I can alter my approach and make it work. And audiences appreciate that you can react well under pressure and not become bitter and sullen and angry. My advice would be, if you were relying primarily on cerebral material and it wasn't really coming across, that you start making a few funny faces and take a pratfall or two, or even ditch the set and work the audience a little bit. Sometimes what happens is you're so intent on delivering your material you forget that you are delivering it for the benefit of an audience. And after all, it all depends on whether the comedian's definition of friendliness matches up to the audience's opinion of what friendliness constitutes, and for that matter, humor. James Fenton says that for a productive life and a happy one, each failure must be felt and worked through. It must form part of the dynamic of your creativity. This is a very important point. Now, some people have a gift for remembering what had transpired minutes, hours, days before, but others need need the crutch of recording devices. I would suggest that the stand-up comedian endeavor to tape record every single monologue he or she does, if at all humanly possible. That is the only way you can learn. You may want to listen to it immediately after the show, if you're a working comedian, or you may want to put it off for a day or two to get that all too important sense of removal from the material, particularly if it's new. However, your technique, what you then want to do is think of some sort of parameter to rate it on, a scale of 1 to 10, or count the number of laughs there were. Try to factor in the number of people in the audience. Try to figure out what your batting average is, your percentage on any given occasion. Before too long, if you do in fact diligently keep notes, and you could just do it right on the cheat sheet if you use one, if you diligently keep notes, then you will be able to weed out what material works, what material doesn't, or what material always works and what material does not always work for that matter, because there is a difference. Sometimes the material is good, but the set and setting in which it is performed is not really the most appropriate one. Terence Rafferty writes about the film Dangerous Minds and says, Dangerous Minds gives us the pleasure of seeing teaching as a kind of comic performance art. Johnson quiets the hecklers, varies her routines, and winds up holding a tough crowd in the palm of her hand. And that's what you have to do up there on a comic stage. Quiet the hecklers, vary your routines, try to get them right in the palm of your hand. I haven't had too many of those, right in the palm of your hand. But after all, this is New England. People tend to be a little more reticent. It's difficult to woo strangers. One of your jobs, and it does not exclude being funny, but one of your jobs is, in fact, to woo and, if possible, charm strangers. I grew up on horseback, says Kay Jackson, psychologist. I grew up on horseback, and one of the things I learned is you need to get back in the saddle as soon as you've been thrown. And that, of course, is rather cliche advice, but very applicable to the world of stand-up comedy. If you decide you want to try it out and you bomb your first 5 times, get right back in the saddle and try it again. I know people sometimes say, look at this moron, he's not enjoying himself. That's David Letterman. Well, whether David Letterman enjoys himself in what he does or not is not for me to say, but he must have a very strong motivation to continue doing it because he has done it for so long and he still does it very well. The man is, in fact, very quick on his feet. Let's familiarize you, shall we, with the names of some of the terms that comedians use. Now, not all of these are quoted from direct experience. In fact, they were cited in the Boston Globe calendar of November 17, 1994. A bucket of blood is a dive club with hecklers. A hell gig is no crowd. I presided over several hell gigs in my career as an MC. Crash and burn. Bad set, no laughs. Freddy Krueger, Room from Hell. I think you get the idea of that. Went up in flames. Down the toilet. Crushed the crowds. Got laughs. Blue material, dirty jokes. Nylon running jacket, Italian tuxedo. Or vice versa. I'm wearing my Italian tuxedo, as you can see. Most Americans, says Alex Hurd, most Americans have experienced that strange sensation produced by certain entertainers. A mixture of hatred, disgust, embarrassment, and pathos. Sometimes, if the performer is sufficiently schlocko or self-congratulatory, this feeling intensifies to a point at which suddenly it becomes highly pleasurable. Pathos, as opposed to pathos. Pathos. For example, watching Jerry Lewis, quote, take on his critics in the waning hours of the Labor Day telethon, or Sammy Davis Jr.'s Mr. Bojangles routine. Well, finally, getting back to the subject of invective, before we finally reach the portion of this particular presentation, which has to do with oratory and rhetoric. The British magazine Private Eye says over on Waugh, Private Eye discovered that the only way to sustain a humorous role in topical journalism is to adopt a posture which is not so much satirical as often plain nasty. And that says about everything one needs to say about invective, that in fact it is frequently and very often a device that journalists and essayists use. Now, our next week's presentation will in fact deal with the comic essay and also with sketch humor. I must say right now at the outset, I don't have an awful lot of material about sketch humor. However, I hope to, given the time. Well, here's a couple of common rhetorical devices. One is called periphrasis. Basically what it means is it's a kind of roundabout way of referring to something by means of several words instead of directly in a single word or phrase. Something like the Emir of Indolence, the most exalted potentate of laziness, His Royal Highness the Wrong Hero would be another way of saying the hero. Anakoluthon, an abrupt change within a sentence to a second construction inconsistent with the first, sometimes used for rhetorical effect. For example, I warned him that if he continues to drink, what will become of him? Comedians use this all the time, and it's not important that you know that it's called anakoluthon. Sometimes in order to pick up the pace, they will edit their verbal barrage in much the same way as film editors will edit a film, jumping directly from one thing to another. They're called jump cuts in film, and if you feel more comfortable with that phrase, you can call them jump cuts in the comedic monologue. And I suppose one example would be something like, well, sure is a nice day out, let's see, and did you know the ATO test, assert the opposite, a useful guide to truth and meaning, applicable to almost everything you hear. For example, if Pat Buchanan says, worthless foreigners are stealing jobs from honest Americans, they ought to all be shipped back on the boat back to where they came from. Now assert the opposite and see if that is equally true. Foreigners provide us with the lifeblood of our nation's strength. They, in fact, take only the jobs that Americans don't necessarily want to perform themselves, and in that way keep wages low and businessmen happy and build up business. And we ought to send more boats and bring more foreign individuals into this country in order to further this process. Of course, that sort of sounds like Pete Wilson before he decided to run for president. I wish I had more of these rhetorical devices to share with you. I only have a few others. One is called enthymeme, or enthymeme, a word or phrase deleted or left incomplete, like Toys R, or something like that, Toys R Us, Toys R. And paralepsis, a device whereby one says something by announcing he's not going to say it, which is a very useful device, particularly if you're in the business of shattering taboos. Like, I don't want to say Bob Dole is way too old and mean to ever be president. I would never be accused of saying that. Is one, and of course the most famous example of paralepsis is, I come to praise Caesar, not to bury him. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him, I'm sorry. Repetition, a vice in prose, is a device in rhetoric. I have seen a great many stand-up comedians use not only repetition, but a leitmotif to very solid effect. People feel somehow like they're getting their money's worth if they find a comedian who does a monologue in which certain words, phrases, themes recur throughout the body of it, building the laugh, building it, building it, building it. I once saw someone at the Holy City Zoo take his 5-minute slot and stretch it out to 12 minutes with this device, and he was getting laughs the whole way through. And that's one of the few times when one should go over one's allotted time limit at these open stage performances, when you're getting so many laughs that it would be a crime not to let you keep going on. How to be an effective speaker? Well, I was hoping to have more to say on this subject, but I don't. However, I will share with you what I know, and this is, of course, straight from the horse's mouth. None other than Roger Ailes advises that you should be prepared, be likable, be open, extemporize, bring some personality and emotion to what you say, lighten up, talk less. Never lie. Don't be hostile. And these are all very good things that you can keep in mind. But particularly, be likable, be open, extemporize, bring some personality and emotion to what you say. Yes, I agree. My body language is in total agreement with that. Mona, did you want to come up here and lick me some more? That would make me even more likable than I already am. There's always one rotten apple, a know-it-all, a cynic, a barracks lawyer, a junior leaguer, a jerk. Negative personalities are those that inhibit others from speaking their minds. I have a good mind to lie. Again, there's always one person in group interaction who is going to play the role of the bad sheep, the rotten apple. Watch good orators, says Susan Goober, who wrote an entire book on how to run for Congress or political office. Watch good orators. They open with an interesting phrase, make eye contact with the whole audience, move their bodies in concert with their words, pause for emphasis, summarize what they've said. Speaking effectively combines conveying information, acting, and entertaining all in one. And the more you speak, the more you'll be able to use parts of an old speech in a new one. Well, excuse me, this advice comes tailor-made for any comedian, so I'll repeat a portion of it. Open with an interesting phrase, make eye contact with the whole audience, and move your bodies in concert with your words. Pause for emphasis. Summarize what you've said. And that does not necessarily mean repeat it verbatim. I keep 2 speeches handy, says Susan. One's about current events, the other generic. I update both speeches constantly. Well, of course, when you've been in the business as long as I have, you won't have just 1 or 2 speeches. You'll have 50 or 60. You'll be ready to speak on any occasion to anyone, particularly if you keep careful, comprehensive notes. The cardinal rule of the public platform is to remember that the mind can digest only what the seat can endure. Well, that reminds me, I've been about an hour into this, and I'm beginning to get a little antsy myself. I'm the guy that's doing the talking. I can just imagine how you feel, but I'll tell you something right now. If you had taken my earlier advice and gotten a video cassette and taped this, then you could sort of watch it in digestible chunks, assuming that you find any of this information useful or interesting. Or you should have been taking notes the whole time. The cardinal rule of the public platform is to remember that the mind can digest only what the seat can endure. That quarrel with others, which we call rhetoric, says W.B. Yeats. That quarrel with others, which we call rhetoric. When a minister quarrels with the devil, it's called preaching. When a politician quarrels with others, it's called rhetoric. When a street corner wit plays the dozens with his companions, it's called talking some shit. This dialogue, this ongoing dialogue with the other, the self versus the other, it goes all the way back to Greek drama. Greek drama started, of course, as epic poetry. Eventually it became the monologue. It split off and became the dialogue. And vituperation has a long and honorable history, going all the way back to what was called by Gershon Legman water wit, people floating down the Thames on boats, exchanging badinage with people on the shore or people on other boats, and the dozens, ghetto street corners, bands of teenaged youth parrying with words. Insult humor. It has a very old and honorable pedigree. That's the word I'm thinking of. And I'm not talking about dog food here. Rhetoric, a politics of voice, says Wilson C. McWilliams. He's talking about Cuomo, but rhetoric basically is used not so much to state what is perfectly evident to everybody and totally non-controversial. Rhetoric is frequently used to persuade others. We'll be talking in a moment about the origins of rhetoric, but one more word of advice about rhetorical technique, addressing an audience. Richard Stengel recently observed of Pat Buchanan, a name very much in the news. Pat Buchanan has mastered the actor's trick of reciting the same lines, but giving them a different emphasis each night. So that's that's a trick that the stand-up comedian would also do well to master, the trick of reciting the same lines, but giving them a different emphasis, a different spin each night, each different, separate, discrete night. Whether it be by cutting out or by adding wordy, paraphrasic types of things to it, all depends. Who invented rhetoric? In George Kennedy's The New History of Classical Rhetoric, he states, who invented rhetoric? Aristotle says Corax from Sicily in the 5th century BC. Corax means a crow, a symbol of squawking mendacity. Rhetoric, according to Gorgias the sophist, induces belief as opposed to knowledge, and for the ancient Greeks, in general, speech writing was to be contrasted to the purities of philosophy. But an eloquent speech may sharpen the experience of insight, just as it may, in the wrong mouth, intensify prejudice. But one cannot imagine a modern QC employing a servant with a pitch pipe, as Gaius Gracchus did, to tell him when he was going over the top. A great many times when comedians appear on television, not comedians, politicians, so hard to tell the difference these days. They'll have somebody on the sidelines. Frank Rizzo was very fond of this technique. They'll have someone on the sidelines making little motions like, ixnay, enough of that subject. Good, keep going, that's good. You're losing them, and so forth. And many comedians could also use such an individual to guide them in how their monologue is going. Unfortunately, many comedians do not have that kind of resource at their beck and call. Well, it is a natural step from the study of oratory and rhetoric to be a consideration of drama, not necessarily solely comic drama, but the art of drama in general, since it has such a great amount of bearing on the art of stand-up comedy. However, I am going to have to take a short break, and I hope to be right back. Well, I'm back. So much to do, so little time. Well, talking a little bit about drama. Tragic drama does not like the city, says Ann Barton. And I trust that if you're watching this, then you at least understand an urban point of view, if you weren't necessarily exactly born and bred in that milieu. Tragic drama does not like the city. Comedy, by contrast, has usually insisted that the urban world constitutes the proper sphere. It confronts its audience with a more or less heightened, a fantasized picture of that audience's own day-to-day life in a city which, although it often shelters prudently under other names, tends to be recognizable as a version of the one just outside the playhouse door. So basically, what she's trying to say here is that comedy belongs in the city. It's not necessarily a medium which thrives in the country. In other words, it's urbanized. And in fact, one will find that the rise of the vaudeville stage coincided with the growing urbanization of the United States. One must remember that as recently as, say, 1920, the country was more rural than urban. More people lived in the country than the city. And, of course, mass communication made it unnecessary to live in the city in order to become wise in its ways. But, on the other hand, mass communication in the forms that we are most familiar with were only nascent in their infancy in 1920. In 1920, there were no commercial radio broadcasts. There were no speaking films, and such silent films as were available were events, once a month or once a year events, and not everyday sorts of things. There was no television. There was the stage. There was vaudeville. There were traveling country fairs and freak shows and roadside zoos and circuses. And medicine shows. Many of these holdovers of the 19th century. As recently as 1920, it was a very different world. And it must surely be a disorienting one for anybody born prior to 1900. Of course, there are fewer and fewer of those individuals. My grandfather is almost one of them. But despite a basic hostility to theater and the arts of impersonation, the city developed out of its own social legends a kind of dramatic presence. To the polite writers for the gentlemanly stage, city dramas were preposterous parodies of true heroic theater. Again, this notion that country tragedy, city comedy, not one that I'm intimately familiar with or can justify at great length, but there is something about the argument which is not totally inimical to my own beliefs. More openly than movie acting or book reading, theater presents a series of moments in some kind of sequence, said the late Harold Brodkey. Now, talking about Brando, Brodkey stated, he was a self-invented one-character actor who does the separate selves in himself as characters. There must have been a reason I took such a note of this, and it is because that is what the comedian does. The comedian takes separate aspects of his life and separate aspects of his personality and utilizes them to create not only characters, but to write his or her material. Now, talking a little bit about the history of the theater, Stephen Greenblatt states, Jacobean theater censors generally would not permit direct representation of any living figure with power or any contemporary public event or controversy. It meant that playwrights and audiences developed a heightened sensitivity to Aesopian indirection. Sometimes art can be improved by having to work its way around prohibitions. sometimes writers can develop an acute ability in certain areas because they are forced to work around areas in which they do not have great expertise. I'm not saying that censorship makes people more creative, but it makes them creative in ways that are easy to appreciate. And I think a great many people lament the coming of profanity and excessive sex and violence, not necessarily out of a sense of misguided prudery, but because there's something so unsubtle about the whole thing. They prefer a kinder, gentler age in which such matters were indeed broached, but not directly, only through indirection, enthymemes, so to speak. The sentence was left unfinished. The murder occurred off stage. Marlon Brando, says Jeffrey O'Brien, utilized acting in which the whole body was implicated, the famous method. Doing Brando was every comic's last resort, good for a laugh when all else failed. Because he was such an individual performer, somewhat akin to Orson Welles during an earlier era, and I suppose his nearest analog would be someone like Robert De Niro nowadays, the method actor who immerses him or herself in the role. But in fact, doing Brando was every comic's last resort, just as doing De Niro's "Go ahead, Johnny, go ahead," or you talking to me? You think I'm funny, don't you? I'm a funny man, Danny DeVito. Give each character an absolutely individual voice. Show profoundly how people change in the wash of experience to represent the individual talking to himself as he works out his destiny. Give every character inside of you an absolutely individual voice. This is Harold Bloom on Shakespeare, but it could easily apply to the stand-up comedian as well. Show how profoundly people change in the wash of experience. Represent the individual talking to himself as he works out his destiny. Now, here's an idea for a set. Yeah, I don't know, should I keep doing this or what? Pietro, the mime, taught that the entire aim of art in the theater was to achieve simplicity. And to a certain degree, when your material cuts to the bone, it is because it has been cut to the bone. Wiley Cypher says that tragedy accepts the flaw in the world as it is, then ventures to find mobility in the inexorable march of actual situations. I guess what he's saying is that a tragedy is basically kind of like a comedy, except it's a more cynical viewpoint, or a more conservative or more Republican viewpoint. Of course, even though liberals can be somewhat humorless, conservatives, on the other hand, can have a sort of an inappropriate type of humor, which isn't really very comic at all. Tragedy is a closed form of art with a single, fixed and contained meaning. Somehow, it shows what must happen, even while there comes a shock of unsurmised disaster. In contrast, comedy is more complex and often less exacting. It embraces contradiction, chaos, and the irrational. It penetrates the surface, our civilized masks, and reveals the prodigal and absurd. On Saturday Night Live, I saw a sketch in which a pregnant woman in the 1960s deliberately exposed herself to a microwave oven. Of course, microwave ovens weren't really commonly used in homes until at the very earliest 1970, so there was an anachronism. But comedy standards are somewhat looser, and it is because comedy plays on, as our friend Wiley Cypher says, contradiction, chaos, the irrational. It penetrates our civilized masks. And I'm not going to take this off. It reveals the prodigal and absurd. Sorry, you'll have plenty of opportunities to see my true face, but at that time, you will find that you will no longer be allowed to live. Playwrights fling words at a living audience watching a stage. And this, of course, is the same definition that we would have to use for the art of stand-up comedy. Stand-up comics fling words at a living audience watching a stage. Of course, a lot of stand-up comics work television, but even then there is a live audience. Filmed and performed before a live audience. Now, you don't necessarily have to have the live audience for something like soap operas or movies of the week or anything like that, or even a stage tragedy could be performed without the input of an audience. But a comedy with no audience on television, that's why they had the canned laughter for so many years. If there was in fact no live audience to laugh, at the very least there could be some feedback implied. As Lenny Bruce pointed out, all the world is showbiz, no matter how it's labeled. There is a great deal of sense in that. Lenny Bruce was very fond of going on and on about how there are no liberals or conservatives, there's just hustlers. Bernard Shaw, a comic genius, considered popular entertainment to be an instrument for moral and social instruction. Well, I can't stress this enough. Entertainment is not necessarily, or even essentially by its very nature, non-ideological. All entertainment has some ideological content, howsoever buried or ambiguous. Farce is based on misunderstanding. And for a good example of how farce is based on misunderstanding, you need go no further than our friend, the French playwright Molière, or for that matter, a typical episode of a popular television program like The Nanny, or Wings. Modern American sitcoms tend to be inimical to classic comedy in that they are farces in which the protagonists play out their emotions in front of an audience rather than keeping their emotions private or making their emotions manifest only to one or two other individuals. Furthermore, the formulaic nature of television sitcoms replicates almost exactly the formulaic nature of the commercial advertising which intersperses it, viz. Husband or wife makes a blunder and vainly attempts to cover it up, only exacerbating the situation further, and it remains for the wise husband or wife, spouse figure, to sweep in and set things right by the end of the 23-minute program, not counting the commercials. And of course, commercials are basically in your topic and structure: product-related crisis, product introduction, crisis resolution. I have a stomach ache. Here, take Tums with calcium. It's something your body needs anyway. Well, I'm a junkie. My body needs heroin too. You got any with that? No, but anyway, ding, hey, I feel better. Farce is based on misunderstanding. Fools make mistakes which wise men have to come and clean up. Paul Johnson talks a little bit about stage writing technique. Now, the reason I go on about drama is I'm not only a comedian, not only do I play a comedian on television, I am a comedian. I'm also a playwright. I haven't really done an awful lot, but I have done enough to call myself that. I've had a couple of things produced. You may have even seen them on one of these programs at one time or another. Playwrights do not necessarily start with a plot at all. Tom Stoppard told me that he gets an idea for a single dramatic incident, then expands it backwards and forwards into a story. And in fact, I did that with my own very recently written Cruel and Unusual Politics, which I hope to present to you at some time. J.B. Priestley said he liked to shuffle people around in time to see what will happen to them. He said to me, I always have felt that Ibsen worked in roughly the same way. I asked John Osborne if he thought of a plot first. Good heavens, no. I start with a character and get him into messes. Osborne had a touch of genius, which I would define as talent heightened to the point where it becomes inexplicable. He could create a theatrical moment so intense but ephemeral that afterwards you could not really explain why it had seemed so magical. About as good a definition of genius as I've ever heard. Tom Stoppard remains the cleverest conversationalist in the common room, but he is still behaving more like a ventriloquist than an artist. I think I'd rather listen to him be brilliant without the intervention of stuffed characters, says Robert Brustein. Stefan Kampfer, another very well-known humorist and playwright, Neil Simon. Almost every Neil Simon work is marked by two conflicts, one between male and female, the other between the playwright's technical skills and his limitless self-absorption. And that, of course, wraps it up about as nicely as I could have hoped to ever have wrapped it up. We in the theater are constantly on the qui-vive for the humorous side of every situation. And of course, if one does live one's life so that you are constantly on the qui-vive for every humorous situation, you will be accused of a lack of seriousness, and as a matter of fact, you will be accused of never taking anything seriously. And you have to be especially careful of laughing inappropriately at those times. American drama. Well, let me just elaborate on that just a little. Comedians, good comedians, ones that are prolific and write a lot of funny material, don't look at life the way many people look at it. They see things through a comic frame, a frame of reference, and generally they have their own strong feelings about things, their own philosophy about how the world works or fails to, and they take their comic frame and they redefine things by summoning up the ability to look through a comic frame. American drama, with some notable exceptions, is often crude, untidy, undisciplined, overwritten, but pulsing with subterranean power in the model of Eugene O'Neill. British drama, with some notable exceptions, is often polished, civilized, witty, technically ingenious, but rather undernourished emotionally, on the model of Noel Coward, Harold Pinter, and the late John Osborne, especially in their early plays, fed an infusion, undernourished emotionally on the model of Noel Coward. Harold Pinter and the late John Osborne, especially in their early plays, fed an infusion of new working-class energy into English theater without losing the Coward connection. David Mamet and Tony Kushner introduced a supply of intelligence into American theater without losing the O'Neill connection. The better playwrights of both countries narrow the ocean that divides us. The lesser ones keep us insular and disengaged, says Robert Brustein. So basically what he's saying is, I guess, British playwrights got the brains, but not much feeling, and American playwrights don't have too much discipline, but by God, they've got feeling in spades. And people like Harold Pinter and John Osborne and David Mamet and Tony Kushner combine the best attributes of both worlds. Since there is nothing original or funny in the show Five Guys Named Mo, the players use the hoariest device to elicit applause. They interact with the audience in the manner of Pete Seeger at a hootenanny. The balcony is exhorted to sing along, then the orchestra is asked to compete. Women are entreated to sing, then men. A Mo leads a conga line up and down the aisle, says Stephen Canfer. Remind me not to go see Five Guys Named Mo. But in this commentary, he makes a very valid point, Stephen Canfer does, that sometimes when the act just isn't working, you can interact with the crowd, but you can't do it in a way that leads them to suspect that the reason you're doing it, the whole rationale behind your doing it, is because your own stuff isn't going over too well, so you might as well generate some humorous material by insulting your audience. Now, if you start out greeting the audience, doing a little audience interaction, then even if your material doesn't go over so well, you have then the option of going back to the audience and what they feel and utilizing that energy that is pulsating from the audience in order to bolster your own failing set. Direction which confuses loudness with authenticity and frantic with funny. I used to have this problem. I would shout out the punchlines, and that's not necessarily the way to go. If you want to emphasize a point, and talk a little more quietly, not louder, and speak a little more slowly, leaving a certain number of pauses between the words you wish to emphasize to create an effect. Well, Stephen Camphor has quite a bit to say about Tom Stoppard. He goes on to state, most of his productions have been university twaddle full of obvious puns and pastiches of more talented artists, among them Shakespeare, Rene Magritte, and even Agatha Christie. I wish I had a citation for this next quote. It is a very good one. A type that fascinated Bertolt Brecht, a servant in secret revolt against his masters. A servant in secret revolt against his masters. Well, that's the story of my life. Alan Bennett talks of John Osborne, and he says, I often disagreed with John Osborne's plays, but I invariably found his tone of voice, however hectoring, much more sympathetic than the rage or the patronizing, oh dear, he's at it again, he still manages to provoke in an audience. The Time obituary for George Abbott stated, the Abbott touch, which eschewed psychological depth for a seamless, balletically precise progression of word, movement, song, and stagecraft, all at a pace somewhere between high-spirited and frenetic. Something for us all to aspire to. I believe that George Abbott had something to do with that current Broadway traveling hit, Damn Yankees. A method actor, said the late George Abbott, was someone who worked so hard for inner feeling that he forgets to bring it out in the light, where we can get a look at it. Stephen Camphor, once again, he writes for, what does he write for? The New Leader. It's not a very well-known magazine, but the dramatic and poetry criticism in it is top flight. Stephen Camphor states, the theater actress plays it both ways. If her neurotic posturing moves the audience, she seems to mean every word. When the seat holders titter, she acts as if the whole scene were camp. It may be an adroit strategy, but it destroys any chance of plausibility. You can't have it both ways in the theater. Either it's good and you intend it to be good, or it's lousy and you deliberately want it to be perceived as lousy. Or it's good, but you want to pretend it's lousy, or it's lousy, but you want to pretend it's good, but you're not going to get away with it. An audience can always relax in Neil Simon's presence, says Stephen Camphor. He unfailingly produces mirth, and he never shoots off a gun in our ears or makes us brood about the rest of the characters after we have left the theater. He wants to be amusing, but aches to be loved. To please ticket holders, Simon offers them everything but the truth. Once again, he has come up with a situation tragedy and papered it over in pastel shades. Long ago, Stephen Camphor goes on to state, the boulevard farce ruled the Rialto. Today that genre has been replaced by the condo comedy, a one-set affair occurring high above the plastic garbage bags and crime-inhibiting streetlights. Once again, we're getting back to the city is comedy and the country is high-minded tragedy. But here we have country in city, the condo high above the teeming city. tragedies papered over with situation comedy. Broadway moonshine, the kind of uncomplicated fantasy that was in fashion before World War II, took the grin away from death, says Stephen Canfor, but those days are no more. Today, before the curtain can rise on opening night, the bills for a major musical amount to over $3 million. So creators and investors shun the inventive in search of the sure thing. Thousands of hours are spent in libraries and at VCRs, searching for the proven story that can be festooned with melody. Of course, the same can be said of Hollywood in general. Stanley Kaufman states, lots of farces start with unlikely pairings, but then comes the real work, going on funnily from there. Comedy is very different than tragedy. Tragedy can almost be formulaic. Hero. Hero presented with adversity. Hero overreaches. Hero displays hubris. Hero falls because of the flaw in his character. But comedy can't be summarized in such a pat fashion at all. There are as many different types of comedic stagecraft as there are basic plots. Farce is the most disciplined of forms, tightly plotted and bound by its own ruthless logic. Farce has taught heightened dialogue, driving the situation onward. You can't ad-lib a farce. When you can see the actors trying to think of what to say next, in those multiple split seconds, the crucial ingredients of farce, tempo and energy, bleed away. And of course, I never tire repeating it, but the same is very true of stand-up comedy. That was the talented Mark Stein. Woody Allen's Central Park West. Its implausibilities nag us as they wouldn't in pure farce, where nobody asks that things stay plausible so long as they remain entertaining, says Brad Liethauser. Playwright Richard Foreman, perhaps better known in New York than he is hereabouts, has something very important to say about stagecraft. He says, to me, art is 99% courage, the courage to follow your vision and to remember what your particular vision is. It's a struggle not to let your mastery take you down that easy road, and in spite of what some people think, I have a mastery in certain areas. I have to cast that off so I'm back in a naked condition, confronting the material of my life. And although it seems rather high-minded to the fledgling comedian to wish to live one's life in such a fashion and to follow one's dream, whatever one's dream may be, remember what your particular vision is. That is the operative phrase. George Saintsbury, who also wrote about prose style, writes about Molière and states, of all dramatists, ancient and modern, Molière is perhaps the one who has borne most constantly in mind the theory that the stage is a lay pulpit, and that its end, is not merely amusement, but reformation of manners by means of amusing spectacles. This is something that Jules Feiffer has discussed, that you have two types of comedy, basically. One is merely amusing and not edifying in the slightest. And the other has a certain point to make. And whether it's amusing but also makes a point, or makes a point but is also amusing, it is comedy which has content behind it. It does not exist merely for its own sake, but to express an idea. And of course, Pfeiffer said that either one is acceptable, but that he prefers the second. And I must say that I am in full agreement with him on that one. Voltaire, another famous French essayist and playwright and novelist, said, I look on solemnity as a disease. I'd rather 1,000 times be as feeble and feverish as I am now than think gloomily. It seems to me that morality, study, and gaiety are three sisters who should never be separated. They are your servants. I take them as my mistresses. Morality, study, and gaiety. Well, I'm a little lax on the morality. I'm not always as charming as I might perhaps be, and I do study quite a bit, but again, these aren't absolute dicta, but these are more or less guidelines. And I present them in just that spirit. Well, I've gone through the better part of a liter of this stuff. Ugh. Now I feel like carbolic acid or phosphoric acid. Oh my God, I'm a phylloketonuria, and this contains phenylene. I'm sorry, phenylalanine. Jeez. Trust your own judgment, says John Osborne. Don't be discouraged by anyone. The only ally you will have is yourself. He's talking about writing plays, but the same holds for comedy. The only ally you will have is yourself. Unless you're Jay Leno and you have a sympathetic wife. The whole world knew that it was John Osborne who established the idea that it would be to the stage that people would look for some sort of recognizable portrait of their own lives, freed from the highbrow pieties of the university on one side and from the crassness of what came to be called the media on the other. The theater alone could celebrate joy and curiosity. It could also affront his deadly enemy, opinion. Stephen Allen, or Steve Allen as he prefers to be called, says, much of the theatrical profession is a matter of vulgarians entertaining barbarians. A little bit of sour grapes there, but his book on how to be funny can be incredibly helpful. One of the few books I've read which actually gives you really good advice, and if you follow it, you really will be funnier. Unfortunately, the really good advice takes up one page of a 150-page manuscript, but anyway, let's get back to drama. Our old pal Tony Kushner states, people shouldn't trust artists and they shouldn't trust art. Part of the fun of art is that it invites you to interpret it. Well, that's something of a false note, but let's go on. Tony Kushner states, people are never consistent. People will always do surprising things, both good and bad, and the way that people surprise themselves and their audience are the most interesting moments of human behavior. The space between what we like to be and what we actually are is where you find out the most interesting things. Tony, that's called satire, the space between what we'd like to be and what we actually are. But let's go on. I think preaching to the converted is exactly what art ought to do. You should assume that the audience you're writing for is smarter than you, says Tony Kushner, and well, I hate to say it, Tone, but in your case, that wouldn't be very difficult. No, what am I saying? You have to say, what am I feeding into? I think you should ask yourself that question and then make the decision based on the answers you come up with. Bravo! That's very good. What is my motive for doing this in the first place? Or, what am I feeding into? The Tony Kushner School of Drama Writing. You have to be willing to scare the horses, he says. You have to be interesting, and you have to be daring, and you have to be willing to write things that shock. Shock is part of art. Art that's polite is not much fun. Well, that's sure as hell true. I can agree with him on that one, at the very least. A slightly moralizing book in the way that farce has to be. Farce does have an element of morality to it. Let's talk a little bit more about Molière. This is David Richards citing Molly Ivins. As writer and actor, Molière portrayed the obstinate will better than anybody before or since. That's one reason he sometimes continues to seem so astonishingly modern. So many of history's catastrophes and just as many personal misfortunes have been brought about by unbending creatures kicking compromise and reason aside and barreling full force into a brick wall. Molière gives us the disasters as high comedy, all-knowing patriarchs as hilariously petty dictators, inflexibility as the funniest of all human substances. Roz Cavaney again. Some of the wittiest conceits are funniest when played for serious emotion and not for crude laughs. And again, this goes back to Molière and his depiction of the obstinate will as the epitome of farce. The obstinate will. Somebody messes things up for whatever reason, but in Moliere it would be because of their obstinate will, and then someone else comes along and either makes the situation worse, or attempts to fix it and makes it worse, or attempts not to fix it, and it somehow gets better by itself. Learning how to think is very important to an actor, says Jack Lemmon. I still believe that acting is not an instinctive craft. It's 90% mental, a process of divining the character, a detective hunt, stripping away and peeling off the layers. When you find the character, there's almost a click. You'll hear an actor say, "I've got him." Then the art becomes one of showing somebody else what you've done. Well, those comedians among us who do impressions could take Jack Lemmon's words to heart. Figuring out a character is vital. Of course, knowing your own character is part and parcel of that very process. Jack Lemmon goes on to say, "I've always preferred theater to film. It's the feeling of theater, the connection. When it's really working, it's like a tight wire between you and the audience." Hal Prince, the Broadway producer-director, states, "Hurdles are often self-imposed. The trouble is, some people have their eyes on the prize, not on the journey. The journey is the fun of it. To be a director, you must direct. To be a singer, you must sing. To be the wrong hero, you must drone on interminably, as I am afraid I am doing. The stage, like a court of law, is a place of argument. Absent an ability to follow the ideas, there is nothing to listen for," says Matthew Gurewitch. The stage is a place of argument. Absent an ability to follow the ideas, there is nothing to listen for. The stage, like a court of law, is a place of argument. A.N. Whitehead stated, "The essence of dramatic tragedy resides in the solemnity of the remorseless working of things." You can see how when things are more remorseless, when things seem to argue with us, that's tragedy. But when people are obstinate, when people are single-minded in their wrongness, that is the essence of comedy, particularly the essence of farce. Things going wrong and leading ones to one's inevitable, unchangeable, immutable fate is tragedy. People going wrong and displaying character or the lack of it, that is comedy. Children and dogs are essential to farce, and as any comedian will tell you, there's no competing with either. Which is probably why so many television sitcoms either have a cute pet or an adorable child spouting words that only a child psychologist would use. Anybody who's seen an autobiographical solo in recent years knows the recipe. Part 1, I was a, your ethnicity here, child, which was confusing. Part 2, I suffered because of society's attitude towards your ethnicity here. Note, this section must have the protagonist suffer at the hands of nasty school kids. Part 3, I am forging ahead despite media treatment of your ethnicity here. This formula was cited by Jan Breslauer. I would certainly hope that if anybody ever gets enough material together to do a one-man show, they will deviate from this horrendous formula. Arthur Miller, I will now cite at great length, quite possibly for the remainder of this, since he has so many applicable things to say about theater. But first, I guess I'd better answer that damn phone. Well, 12 minutes left. That's more time than I thought I had. So, anyway, Arthur Miller states, I could not imagine a theater worth my time that did not want to change the world. It just goes back to John Osborne and his belief that you can use theater to address the central paradoxes of your age in a way that mass media and even novels to a certain degree can no longer do so. Stanley Kaufman states, when an actor leaves the stage, he steps out of the play. When an actor leaves a film shot in any direction, we simply assume that he is continuing on in the rest of the world. And there, of course, is a big difference between the medium of theater and the medium of film. The stage and the decor, says André Bazin in Theater and Cinema, the stage and the decor, where the actor unfolds, constitutes an aesthetic microcosm inserted perforce into the universe, but essentially distinct from the nature which surrounds it. It is not the same with cinema, the basic principle of which is the denial of any frontiers to action. A more abstruse way of putting it. On the screen, man is no longer the focus of the drama, but will become eventually the center of the universe. The impact of his action may there set in motion an infinitude of waves. The decor that surrounds him is part of the solidity of the world. Gore Vidal states, only when the writer hears the actors say what he has written can he tell what's wrong. He can also adjust dialogue to fit an actor's particular talent, the way a composer writes for a specific musical instrument. And that's the importance of having a viable theater troupe in your town if you wish to write dramas. Because a play will go through many stages before it finally hits the real stage. First, you'll write it, and then you'll take it to a playwriting group and read portions of it to fellow playwriting members, and then you will take it for a staged reading, which is step 3, and then finally, if enough of the kinks are ironed out and the production looks like it's viable, it will go to step 4, an actual production, which may vary in length from 1 week to several months. Although runs of several months for unknown playwrights are very rare, and the average is more like 3 weeks. I had I co-wrote a play which ran for 3 weeks in 1987, and I had a staged reading of 3 one-act plays, but that was only for 2 nights. And then I had one of those plays which was part of the staged reading go to production in 1993, I believe it was, or was it 94? I believe it was 94 actually, and that ran for about 2 weeks, maybe 3. And I have a play now that I'm working on, which hopefully will more or less bypass the talking out phase and go directly to staged reading, and then perhaps eventually get a full-fledged performance. I always had a contempt for actors, says Randy Newman. They are small people with big heads. I couldn't speak the language. I'd say, go a little slower, and it was like I hit him on the head with an axe. But the actors bring things that are better than what's on the page. A very succinct way of putting it, but very true all the same. The actors bring things that are better than what's on the page. The comedian is the message, if I may distort Marshall McLuhan in applying this directly to comedy. It's not the words on the page that matter so much, although that is a big part of it. It's the way they're done and every little thing that goes into the presentation of them. His style is practically invisible as well as practically universal in its possible good uses, said James Agee on John Huston. Noel Coward, said John Lahr, often streamlined both his plays and his persona, revealing only what was necessary. With his dressing gown and his suave, playful good manners, he defined the popular notion of swank. The work and the man had a disarming symmetry. They were clipped, bright, and confident. They simultaneously exploited and mocked the manners of the time. In the pithy dialogue and sprightly pacing of his plays, Coward brought English society up to speed and made it aware of the danger in the century's momentum. At a certain velocity, all things disintegrate. He was the first to articulate on stage the metaphysical exhaustion behind the 20s. binge. John Lahr, of course, is speaking of the 1920s, but we might just as easily speak of the metaphysical exhaustion behind the binge of the 20th century itself. Richard Oliva states, real drama, as long as we're not speaking of melodrama or farce, isn't defined by external action. Drama is the ride to revelation, crystallization, epiphany, taken by one or more protagonists. Real drama isn't defined by external action. It's the ride to revelation. Farce, on the other hand, could very well be the obstinate refusal of the characters to face reality. Mel Brooks didn't invent the clash of periods gag. Very few undergraduate reviews have not used it, says Stanley Kaufman, talking about anachronisms in farce. Very rarely in theater history has controversy damaged the box office, says Peter Thompson. You can see I'm sort of like just tossing this together like a tossed salad in the last few minutes here. The well-made play thrives on fortuitous entrances and exits, mistaken identity, and quid pro quo, says the Cambridge Guide to the Theater, although they could very well be speaking of the soap opera, as a matter of fact. Drei Gesprach, 3 speakers, a dialogue interrupted by a third speaker, and it's a device as old as Sophocles, although Robert Altman uses it to good effect in many of his theatrical performances, which in fact, he directs these movies, which are an awful lot like stage play, except they're fluid, because they're of the cinema. Harold Pinter has always been remarkable for his ability to imagine domestic life as a police state, says Finian O'Toole. Michael Goldman in The Actor's Freedom states, any playwright, actor, or director knows that aggression is an essential ingredient of drama, but not perhaps for the reasons familiarly proposed. Conflict in the text of the play. Rather, the importance of aggression has more to do with the aggression the actor himself must use to assume his role and maintain contact with his audience. The effort to set actors loose, to harness and encourage their terrific energies, requires an aggression which must be felt in every turn of dialogue, in every corner of the play, says Michael Goldman. Now, Robert Brustein weighs in and states, the distinction between personality and character is a major theme of modern drama. Luigi Pirandello wrote innumerable plays about the tension between what you are and what society expects you to be or thinks you are. For Pirandello, personality was the rigid mask we place over our features in order to placate the busybody's hunger to define and classify, while character, for him, was the suffering face, spontaneous, evanescent, unknowable, and that is why actors are our most celebrated personalities. Being role players, constantly shifting skins, playing a multitude of characters, they represent the masks used in the drama, or dramatis personae. Of course, one might also refer to Camus and what he has to say in The Myth of Sisyphus on the topic of the actor as the existential man. Mark Steyn talks about the song People, but it's a very good summation of what I'm getting at in this section on the drama. People fulfills the definition of a theater song. It takes the specific and universalizes it. Take the specific and universalize it. You'll do a lot better that way in stand-up comedy than if you take the universal and attempt to make it specific to you. But over the years, Streisand has so universalized it that there's no specifics left, and that is a danger of overperforming certain material. Valerie Miner says, as much dramatist as novelist, Iris Murdoch tells stories through dialogue, gesture, and allegory more than psychological or sensual description. Donald Lyons states, it is perhaps time for playwrights to abandon identity and look to the great sources of artistic vitality, above all, family. Now, we're getting into this family thing again and again and again. Orson Welles, says Richard Corliss, had the star quality of some tribal monster god. Let us talk a little bit about comedy now in the closing moments of our presentation. Great comedy is cruel, says John Lahr, and therefore is written by the young. William Congreve was only 30 when he wrote The Way of the World. Laughter lives and dies by fashion. Once the theater-going public began to change, so inevitably did the comedy it paved the sea. Vice and cynicism were on their way out. The sentiment and moralizing wit of London's emergent middle classes were on their way in. Congreve learned the hard bourgeois lesson of the marketplace. Form follows money. Voltaire spoke of Congreve's characters and stated, "The language is everywhere that of men of honor, but their actions are those of knaves." Once again and again and again, the conflict between what seems to be and what in fact is. Or, as Lahr puts it, the tension between decorum and desire is the hilarious drama of the play, and the subtext of ritualized upper-class English life, manners as a game, a kind of hunt for both fortune and feeling. To conclude, true wit is a playful social emollient that honors the integrity of others while negotiating a truce with reality. At its worst, wit is only a decoration that multiplies the emptiness of a lost soul. Wit's goal is to achieve harmony gracefully. Next time, I think we'll be probably talking a little bit about Arthur Miller, and as an afterthought, so to speak.